Let's now talk about the deductive approach, which has been very popular in many traditional ELT contexts. Deductive approach is actually a rule-driven or rule-governed grammar teaching. In this form of grammar teaching, students are usually exposed to certain rules of the language. Then some examples are presented to them for the sake of explanation. Students then, based on those explanations, they try to practice those rules, sometimes by making their own examples later on. In this way, most of the time is a rule-governed method of teaching grammar in language classrooms. Apart from this, it also becomes a teacher-centered approach in which a teacher holds the authority. He tells the rules to the students, and students have to follow the explanations provided by the teacher. One of the examples of this approach may be that you explain certain rule to the students in the classroom. For example, you explain the form and use of third conditional to students. Then they are asked to do a fill gap exercise, and then later on they prepare their own examples based on the same rule. It may be useful in the conditions where we have some lower level learners who need a base to begin with. So it may be helpful in preparing some solid base for young learners. It may also be helpful in case of the learners who are used to the traditional way of teaching and learning, where the learners expect teachers to tell them various rules and patterns of learning and the organization of knowledge. It may also be helpful in dealing with highly motivated students and those students who are preparing for written exams. There may be many advantages of using a deductive approach. For example, it's quite a time-saving approach. It goes to the point straight away and saves time in many ways. For example, you don't have to read lengthy text in order to find rules. Rather, rules are told straight away in the classroom, and then they are practiced. So it may be, in this sense, somehow a time-saving approach. It also respects the intelligence and maturity of grown-up students, because it acknowledges the role of cognitive processes in learning. Therefore, this may be helpful for mature students as well. It also confirms students' expectations in language learning classroom, especially expectations related to their understanding that they would be informed about something, they would be given knowledge about something. So teacher straight away tells the rules of grammar, and their expectation is associated that they have been told something. And it also allows the teacher to teach certain language points with more accuracy, which is obviously a good advantage to have. There has been some criticism on a deductive approach as well. For example, some people believe that it teaches grammar in an isolated way, which is devoid of any knowledge of the context. Moreover, it is also believed that a little attention is paid to meaning, and the most of the focus is on the form of the language. Then the practical part of this approach is also quite mechanical. And lessons in this approach may be challenging for those learners who are not familiar with the terminology of grammar. So at the beginning, they might find the teaching of grammar quite challenging. Teacher explanation may also be boring, and we all know that it is also at the expense of students' involvement and interaction. This may reduce students' involvement and interaction, and teachers control would be greater. Therefore, it may not be helpful for the communicative purposes. Then explanation is also seldom memorable because other forms, as compared to other forms of explanation in the classroom, for example, demonstration, they are quite good at memorizing things. So students might be able to memorize things more easily through demonstration instead of explanation. So explanation may not be a very good idea, but it is a key element of deductive approach. It also develops a belief among students that language learning is simply a case of knowing grammar, which is obviously not a good idea in the term that student may not develop the ability to communicate in a second language if they develop such a belief. Deductive approach revolves around certain rules or focus on rules as well as their explanation. Let's try to find out what kind of rules could be there in a grammar teaching. We begin with prescriptive rules. Prescriptive rule is the one which guides the behavior of learners. It tells the students what should be done, corrects them. For example, we know there is a prescriptive rule that we need to use shall in case of first pronoun and will in case of third person, second and third person pronouns. Descriptive rule is the one which describes the way people use language in a certain situation or in a certain society. It does not correct things or recommend things. Rather, it tells us in which way the language is being used. For example, we do not use the with proper nouns referring to people. There are some other rules as well. For example, pedagogic rules. Pedagogic rules are related to form and the use of language. There could be certain attributes of a good rule. A good rule must be clear and simple. Students may not spend a lot of time and energy to understand a rule. The rule should be clear in all ways so that students may understand it quickly. It should have an element of familiarity because in this way it should involve various aspects of language which students are already familiar with. So it would make the task of learning a rule or understanding a rule easier for new learners. A good rule must also be relevant to the needs of the students, and it should answer the questions which students are worried about. In the end, and the most important point is that a rule must also include its limitations and exceptions. The areas or those uses of language where that rule does not apply should be mentioned clearly in grammar books, and therefore should also be explained clearly to the students in a classroom.